John tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove through the winding roads of Beverly Hills. The neighborhood was worlds away from the modest streets he was used to. Towering palm trees lined the immaculate sidewalks, and every house he passed seemed bigger and more extravagant than the last. His old pickup truck felt wildly out of place among the shiny black SUVs and sleek sports cars parked along the streets. He glanced at the address again on his phone. 101 Regal Drive, he muttered, squinting at the numbers on the gates he passed. Then he saw it. A massive wrought iron gate with gold accents and the unmistakable 101 engraved in a stone pillar. He whistled under his breath. Well, this must be it. Pulling up to the intercom, John pressed the button. A calm, almost robotic voice answered. "State your name and purpose." John Miller, here to fix an electrical issue," he said, adjusting the strap of his tool belt. The gate creaked open slowly, revealing a long driveway lined with manicured hedges. At the end stood a mansion that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a movie. It was a sprawling white structure with tall columns, large windows, and a fountain centerpiece that probably cost more than his entire house. "Damn," John muttered as he parked his truck near the fountain. He grabbed his toolbox from the passenger seat and stepped out, feeling both impressed and out of his depth. The front door opened before he could knock. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit greeted him with a nod. "Mr. Blake is expecting you. Please follow me." John hesitated for a moment, then followed the man into the house. The interior was even more extravagant than the outside. Gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with art that looked like it belonged in a museum. He felt like a fish out of water, his steel-toed boots echoing loudly against the polished floors. The man led him to a study where Edward Blake, the man of the house, was waiting. Edward was seated behind a massive oak desk, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, and his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. He looked up from a document he was signing and gave John a polite but distant smile. "Ah, you must be the electrician," Edward said, rising from his chair and extending a hand. His voice was smooth, the kind that belonged to someone used to giving orders. John shook his hand, noting how firm the grip was. "Yeah, I'm here about the outlet issue in the West Wing." Edward nodded. "Yes, it's been acting up. James will show you the way." As John followed James, he couldn't help but glance around. The hallways were lined with framed photographs, and he caught glimpses of a younger Edward with various celebrities and dignitaries. But as they turned a corner, one photograph stopped John in his tracks. It was a small black frame, tucked between larger, more prominent photos. Inside was a picture of a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing in a park. The boy had messy brown hair and a shy smile, but it wasn't the setting or the child's pose that caught John's attention. It was the fact that the boy in the photo was him. John's stomach flipped. His first instinct was that it couldn't be. He moved closer, squinting at the picture. There was no doubt. It was him. Same striped shirt, same gap-toothed grin. He remembered the day vividly. His mom had taken him to the park for his birthday. "Something wrong?" James asked, his voice breaking through John's daze. John turned slowly, gripping his toolbox tighter. "That picture," he said, nodding toward the frame. "Where did it come from?" James followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You'll have to ask Mr. Blake about that." Without another word, John marched back to the study, his heart pounding. Edward looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. "You've got a picture of me on your wall," John said, his voice sharp. "Why?" Edward's expression shifted, the calm demeanor cracking just slightly. "I think you're mistaken?" "Mistaken," John said, holding back a bitter laugh. "I know my own face, Mr. Blake. That's me in that picture. So how the hell do you have it?" Edward hesitated, his eyes darting to James, who quietly slipped out of the room, leaving them alone. The air grew heavy with tension as Edward stood, walking slowly to a cabinet near his desk. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and placed it on the desk. "I was hoping to ease into this conversation," Edward said quietly. "But I suppose there's no avoiding it now." John crossed his arms, waiting for an explanation. Edward gestured to the folder. "Before I say anything, I need you to look at what's inside." John opened the folder reluctantly. Inside were several more photos of him as a child. along with handwritten notes and what appeared to be private investigator reports. His chest tightened as he flipped through the pages, each one deepening the pit in his stomach. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward met his eyes, and for the first time, there was something vulnerable in his expression. "John, there's a reason your picture is in my house. You're my son." John stared at Edward, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. The room felt smaller, as though the air had been sucked out, leaving only tension and disbelief. He wanted to laugh, to call the man in front of him a liar, but the seriousness in Edward's eyes made the words stick in his throat. "You've got to be kidding me," John finally said, slamming the folder shut. "Is this some kind of joke? Because if it is, it's not funny." Edward sighed deeply, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "I wish it were a joke, John, but it's the truth." John took a step back, shaking his head. "The truth. You don't get to drop something like that on me and call it the truth. You don't know anything about me." Edward's face softened, though the lines of regret etched around his mouth became more pronounced. "You're right. I don't know you, and that's my fault. But if you'll let me explain—" "Explain what?" John interrupted, his voice rising. "How you decided to play family detective. How you somehow know more about my life than I do." Edward remained silent for a moment, watching John carefully. "You deserve answers," he said finally, "but you also deserve the full story. Will you sit down and let me tell you?" John hesitated. Every instinct told him to storm out, but curiosity, mixed with a strange, unsettling feeling, kept him rooted in place. Slowly, he sank into the leather chair across from Edward's desk. Edward sat as well, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "It was over 25 years ago," he began, his voice measured. "I was young, arrogant, and frankly, a coward. I met your mother, Mary, at a diner not far from my college campus. She worked the morning shift while putting herself through nursing school." John frowned. His mother had never mentioned working at a diner. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself, deciding to let Edward continue. "She was unlike anyone I'd ever met," Edward said, his gaze distant, as though picturing the past. "She was kind but tough, smart but unpretentious. We fell in love quickly, too quickly maybe." John crossed his arms, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The idea of his mother and this man, a millionaire living in a mansion, felt impossible to reconcile. Edward hesitated, his voice faltering. "But my father, he didn't approve. He said Mary was beneath our family, a distraction. He threatened to disown me if I didn't break things off. And you just listened to him." John snapped, unable to hide the bitterness in his tone. Edward nodded solemnly. "At the time, I thought I didn't have a choice. I thought losing my inheritance would ruin my life. So I did what he wanted. I ended things with Mary." John's chest tightened. The thought of his mother, young and vulnerable, being cast aside for money made his blood boil. "And then what? You just walked away and forgot about her?" "No," Edward said quickly, shaking his head. "I never forgot her. I tried to find her again a year later, but by then she was gone. I hired private investigators, but it was like she had vanished. I didn't know she was pregnant." He stopped, his voice catching. "I didn't know about you." John stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," he said, pacing the room. "Why now? Why dig this up after all these years?" Edward rose as well, his expression earnest. "Because I finally found you. A few months ago, my investigator tracked down Mary. That's when I learned about you. I couldn't sit back and do nothing, John. Not again." "Mary," John repeated, the name of his mother suddenly feeling foreign on his tongue. "She's known about this. She never said a word. She probably thought she was protecting you," Edward said. "She knew what my father was capable of. She must have thought you were better off without me." John let out a sharp laugh, more bitter than amused. "Well, she got that right." Edward didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, John grabbed the folder from the desk and turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Edward asked, his voice edged with concern. "To get the truth," John said without looking back. From her, later that evening, John pulled into his mother's driveway. The modest one-story house where he'd grown up looked the same as always. But tonight, it felt different, like a place that had been hiding secrets all along. Mary opened the door before he could knock. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back, and her face lit up in a smile when she saw him. "John, what a surprise." He didn't return her smile. "We need to talk." Mary's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing warmth. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. Inside, John placed the folder on the kitchen table and opened it. Letting the photos and papers spill out, Mary's eyes widened as she took in the contents, her hand flying to her mouth. "You've got some explaining to do," John said, his voice tight. "What is all this? And why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Mary sank into a chair, her shoulders sagging. "I was hoping this day would never come," she murmured. "Well, it's here," John said. "Start talking." Mary sat silently at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the photos. Her eyes lingered on the image of John as a little boy, smiling brightly in the park. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. But John noticed. "Mom," he said, his voice softening despite his frustration. "Why didn't you ever tell me about him? About Edward Blake?" She let out a shaky sigh, setting the photo back on the table. "I never wanted to lie to you, John. But it wasn't that simple." "Not that simple," John scoffed, pacing the small kitchen. "You knew who he was this whole time. You knew he was out there and you never said a word. Why?" Mary looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and defiance. "Because I didn't want you to grow up hating a man you'd never met. And I didn't want you to get hurt by someone who had already hurt me." John stopped pacing, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "Hurt you? How, Mom?" "He said he loved you. Said he wanted to find you." Mary let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Edward Blake loved his comfort and his privilege more than anything else. The minute his father told him to end things, he didn't even fight for me." John felt a pang of sympathy for his mother, but it was quickly overshadowed by his own confusion. "So that's it. He made a mistake, and you decided to keep me in the dark forever." Mary's voice grew firm, a tone he rarely heard from her. "It wasn't just a mistake, John. It was a choice that left me alone, scared and pregnant. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I wasn't about to risk your safety." John frowned. "What do you mean by what he was capable of? Are you talking about him or his father?" Mary hesitated, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "His father was a cruel man, John. Controlling, manipulative. When Edward and I were together, he made it clear I wasn't welcome in their world. And when I refused to walk away, he made it even clearer that he would do whatever it took to keep Edward away from me." John stared at her, his mind racing. What did he do? Mary's gaze dropped to the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "He threatened to ruin my life, to destroy any chance I had of finishing school, of finding work, and when I still wouldn't back down, he had me followed. He made sure I knew he was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. It was terrifying." John felt his stomach churn. He couldn't imagine his mother, young and alone, dealing with that kind of intimidation. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Go to the police. Who would have believed me?" Mary said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He was Edward Blake Sr., one of the most powerful men in the state, and I was just a waitress trying to make ends meet." John sat down across from her, his anger softening into something more complicated. "So you ran," he said quietly. "You disappeared." Mary nodded. "I didn't have a choice. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I knew I had to protect you. I couldn't let him find us. I couldn't risk losing you." John rubbed his temples, trying to process everything. "And Edward, he really didn't know. He says he tried to find you." Mary's expression softened slightly. "Maybe he did, but by the time he got around to it, I was long gone. And honestly, John, I didn't want to be found." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling heavily between them. Finally, John broke the quiet. "He says he wants to make things right," he said, his tone skeptical, "that he wants to get to know me." Mary looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "And what do you want?" John hesitated. He didn't know the answer to that question. Part of him wanted to slam the door on Edward and his money, his mansion, his whole complicated life. But another part of him, a quieter, nagging part, felt the pull of curiosity, the need to understand the man who claimed to be his father. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know if I can trust him." Mary reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I understand, but whatever you decide, just remember, you don't owe him anything, John. You don't owe him your forgiveness or your time. That's your choice to make." John nodded, though the knot in his chest didn't loosen. What if he's telling the truth? What if he really didn't know? Mary sighed, her shoulders slumping. Then that's for him to prove, isn't it? John stayed for another hour, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. But the tension lingered as he drove home. His mind raced with questions. He replayed Edward's words over and over, trying to parse the sincerity in them. For the first time in his life, he felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to find them or throw the whole thing away. John parked his truck outside Edward's mansion for the second time that week. He stared at the massive gates, debating whether to turn around and leave. Part of him still wanted to slam the door on all of this, to pretend he never found that photo, never had that conversation with Edward. But the other part, the one that couldn't ignore the unanswered questions, was stronger. With a resigned sigh, he pressed the intercom. The gate creaked open, and he drove up the long driveway, parking near the fountain again. This time, James was already waiting at the door. "Mr. Blake is expecting you," James said, his tone neutral as always. John followed him inside, but instead of going to the study, James led him to a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling gardens. Edward was standing near a bookshelf, flipping through a worn photo album. He looked up when John entered, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "John," Edward said, closing the album and setting it on a table. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." "Neither was I," John admitted, leaning against the doorframe. "But here I am. You said you wanted to explain more, so go ahead." Edward motioned for John to sit on one of the leather armchairs, but John stayed where he was. Edward nodded, as if understanding his hesitation, and sat down himself. "First, I want to thank you for giving me another chance to talk," Edward began. "I know this isn't easy for you, and I don't take that lightly." "Just get to the point," John said, crossing his arms. Edward took a deep breath. "I already told you about my father, how he forced me to end things with your mother. But what I didn't tell you is how far he went to make sure I never found her again." John frowned. "What do you mean?" "When I tried to reach out to Mary a year after our breakup, she was already gone," Edward said. "At first I thought she'd moved on, maybe started a new life, but something didn't add up. She'd left without a trace. No forwarding address, no contact with anyone we knew." John's jaw tightened. "Yeah, because your father scared her off," Edward nodded. "I didn't know that at the time. I was furious with myself for not trying harder, for not standing up to him when I had the chance. I hired a private investigator to look for her, but every lead turned into a dead end." He paused, his gaze distant. "Years later, after my father passed away, I found out he'd been intercepting all my attempts to contact Mary, letters I sent, phone calls I made. He made sure none of it reached her. He even paid off the private investigators I hired to give me false reports." John's stomach churned. He'd known Edward's father was a manipulative man, but hearing the extent of his interference made his blood boil. "So he just erased her from your life?" "Exactly," Edward said, his voice tight. "And I let him. I didn't fight hard enough, and because of that, I lost you both." John looked away, his emotions swirling. He wanted to hate Edward for his weakness, but he couldn't ignore the pain in the man's voice. "Why are you telling me all this now? What difference does it make?" "Because I need you to know the truth," Edward said. "Not just about the past, but about what I'm trying to do now. Finding you wasn't just about reconnecting. It was about making things right, about owning up to my failures and proving to you that I'm not the man my father was." John let out a bitter laugh. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "Throw some money my way. Write me into your will." Edward shook his head. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, and I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness. All I want is a chance to get to know you, to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." The sincerity in Edward's voice caught John off guard. He had expected more arrogance, more entitlement. Instead, he saw a man burdened by regret, trying to claw his way back from years of mistakes. Before John could respond, the door opened, and James entered, his expression unusually tense. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Edward frowned. "Who?" James hesitated. "It's Mrs. Collins." John watched as Edward's face darkened. "Tell her I'm not available." "I already did, sir," James said carefully. She insisted. "Who's Mrs. Collins?" John asked. His curiosity piqued. Edward's jaw tightened, and for the first time since John met him, he seemed genuinely rattled. "She's someone who complicates things." Before John could press further, a woman's voice rang out from the hallway. "Edward, don't tell me you're hiding from me now." A moment later, a tall, elegant woman strode into the room. She had sharp features, perfectly styled blonde hair, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze flicked to John, then back to Edward. Well, she said, her tone dripping with mock surprise. "Is this the famous long-lost son I've heard so much about?" John's gut tightened. He didn't know who this woman was, but the way she looked at him, like he was an insect she was debating whether to crush, sent a chill down his spine. Edward stood, his posture rigid. "What do you want, Linda?" Linda's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd stop by and see what all the fuss was about." Her gaze shifted back to John, and she tilted her head, studying him. "You certainly don't look like someone who belongs in a place like this." John bristled, but kept his mouth shut. Sensing there was more to this woman than met the eye, Edward, however, wasn't as restrained. "You've said your piece," he said firmly. "Now leave." Linda chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Oh, Edward, you should know by now. I never leave without getting what I want." John leaned back against the chair, arms crossed, watching the tense exchange between Edward and Linda. The air in the room felt thick, the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. Edward stood like a wall, his face carved with anger, and something John couldn't quite place. Fear? Maybe Linda, on the other hand, looked completely at ease, her sharp eyes cutting between the two men like she was surveying her prey. "Who the hell is she?" John finally asked, breaking the silence. Linda's lips curled into a smile. "Oh, Edward, you didn't tell him about me. That's disappointing, considering how deeply I'm intertwined in your little family history." Edward's voice was cold and measured. "Linda, this isn't the time or place. Leave." But Linda ignored him, her focus now squarely on John. "I suppose introductions are in order, Linda Collins. I was married to Edward's father, which I guess makes me your step-grandmother. Charming, isn't it?" John blinked, processing the words. "You were married to his dad." "That's right," Linda said, casually walking over to the nearest armchair and sitting down like she owned the place. "And let's just say I was around for all the drama your mother caused." "That's enough," Edward snapped, his voice sharp. "You don't get to rewrite history, Linda." Linda chuckled, crossing her legs. "Oh," Edward, always so defensive. "The truth is, John, your existence was a rather inconvenient little secret. Edward Sr. and I worked very hard to ensure things stayed orderly." John's stomach churned. "What the hell is she talking about, Edward?" Edward exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "She's talking about the lengths my father went to separate me from your mother. And apparently, she's decided to take some of the credit." "Not credit," Linda corrected with a smirk. "Responsibility, after all. Your father and I were a team. It was my idea to send that investigator after Mary. Someone had to keep the family's reputation intact." John's jaw tightened, anger rising in his chest. "You followed my mom. You threatened her." Linda waved a hand dismissively. "I wouldn't call it threatening, more like encouraging her to move on." John shot to his feet, his fists clenched. "You ruined her life. You ruined both of our lives." Linda tilted her head, her expression unbothered. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she managed. "Just fine, didn't she? And look at you. Salt of the earth, hard-working, just like she wanted." Edward stepped forward, his voice dangerously low. "You crossed a line, Linda. You and my father both. But this ends now." Linda raised an eyebrow, her amusement faltering. "Oh, Edward, always the righteous one. But let's not forget, you let it happen. You walked away. Don't pin all of this on me." Edward flinched at her words, and John felt his anger flare again. "Don't listen to her," John said, his voice sharp. "She's just trying to shift the blame." Linda stood, her composure snapping back into place. "Believe what you want," she said, brushing invisible lint off her sleeve. "But if you think you're entitled to anything from this family, you're sorely mistaken." John frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Linda's smile returned, razor sharp. "Let's just say there are certain people who stand to lose a great deal if you suddenly become part of Edward's world. And I wouldn't count on everyone being as welcoming as dear old daddy here." Edward stepped in front of John, his voice firm. "Enough, Linda. Get out." Linda shrugged, as if she hadn't just threatened them both. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." She turned and strode out of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The sound faded, but the tension she left behind lingered like a storm cloud. John let out a shaky breath, his hands still balled into fists. Who the hell is she really? And why do I feel like this isn't over? Edward sighed, sitting down heavily on the couch. Linda is dangerous. She's always been more interested in power and money than anything else. When she married my father, she saw herself as the gatekeeper of our family legacy. She'll do whatever it takes to keep control. And you let her get away with it, John said, his tone accusatory. Edward looked up, his eyes filled with regret. I didn't have a choice. My father gave her free rein, and by the time I realized how deep her claws were, it was too late. She knew every secret, every weakness, and she used them. John paced the room, his anger simmering just below the surface. So now what? She just admitted to stalking my mom, and she's clearly not done messing with us. Are we supposed to just wait for her next move? Edward straightened, his jaw set. No, we're not. I'm not letting her or anyone else come between us again. The conviction in Edward's voice surprised John. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of the man who might have fought for Mary all those years ago. If circumstances had been different, then what do we do? John asked, his voice quieter now. Edward stood, placing a hand on John's shoulder. We start by digging into the past. If Linda wants to play games, we'll be ready. The following morning, John found himself standing in the kitchen of his small home, staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the past days weighed heavily on him. His life had been simple, predictable, and now it felt like someone had ripped open a door to a past he never knew existed. A past filled with betrayal, lies, and secrets. His phone buzzed on the counter, snapping him out of his thoughts. The caller ID displayed Edward's name. John hesitated for a moment before answering. What? He said, his tone sharper than he intended. John, Edward began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. I need to talk to you. Can you come by the house? John rubbed his temples. What now, more family drama? It's about Linda, Edward replied. I've been looking into some things, and there's something you need to see. John sighed. As much as he wanted to ignore this tangled mess, he couldn't deny his curiosity, or the growing need to understand the man who claimed to be his father. Fine, I'll be there in an hour. When John arrived at the mansion, Edward greeted him at the door, looking more disheveled than usual. His normally pristine suit was slightly wrinkled, and there was a shadow of stubble on his chin. Rough night, John asked, stepping inside. You could say that, Edward muttered, leading him to the study. The room smelled faintly of whiskey, and an empty glass sat on the desk next to a stack of old papers. Edward gestured for John to sit, but John remained standing, crossing his arms. Just get to the point, Edward nodded, his expression somber. I've been reviewing some of my father's old records, financial documents, personal correspondence, things I hadn't thought to look at before, and I found something disturbing. He slid a folder across the desk toward John. Take a look. John opened the folder reluctantly. Inside were pages of typed letters and financial statements, many of them signed by Edward's father, but one document stood out. A transfer of funds to a private investigator, dated just a few weeks before Mary disappeared. This is from the guy who followed my mom, John asked, his voice low. Edward nodded. Yes, it confirms what Linda said. She and my father hired someone to track Mary down and pressure her to leave. But there's more. Edward pulled another paper from the stack and handed it to John. It was a handwritten letter, the ink smudged in places but still legible. The signature at the bottom read, Linda Collins Blake. John scanned the letter, his stomach sinking with each word. It detailed a conversation between Linda and the investigator about keeping Mary's whereabouts a secret, not just from Edward, but from anyone who might ask questions later. The final line hit him like a punch to the gut. Ensure she disappears for good. No loose ends. John dropped the paper onto the desk. She wanted my mom gone, permanently. Edward leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. It looks that way, but I don't think my father was fully aware of what she was doing. He might have been ruthless, but he wouldn't have gone that far. John let out a bitter laugh, and that's supposed to make it better. He let her run the show, didn't he? Edward didn't respond immediately. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water and took a slow sip before speaking. You're right. He let her get away with too much, and now we're left to deal with the consequences. John paced the room, his mind racing. So what now? We know she's behind this, but what are we supposed to do about it? Edward set the glass down, his jaw tightening. We gather more evidence. Linda isn't just a threat to us. She's a threat to everyone connected to this family. If we can prove what she's done, we can stop her. John stopped pacing, turning to face Edward. You say that like it's going to be easy. She's got money, connections, and no problem using them to get what she wants. Edward met his gaze, his expression resolute. That's why we have to be smart and careful. If we make a move too soon, she'll destroy whatever evidence we have. John shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. This is insane. I came here to fix a damn outlet, and now I'm stuck in some soap opera about a crazy step-grandmother and a father I didn't even know I had. Edward's lips twitched in a faint smile. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? John didn't laugh. Instead, he grabbed the folder and tucked it under his arm. I'll help you dig into this, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for my mom. Edward nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Fair enough, thank you, John. As John left the mansion, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He still didn't trust Edward completely, but the look in his eyes when he handed over the evidence had been genuine. For now, that was enough to keep him in the fight. Back at his house, John spread the documents across his kitchen table, poring over every detail. The more he read, the more furious he became. Linda hadn't just manipulated Edward and his father. She had actively destroyed lives to maintain her control over the Blake fortune. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Edward. Be careful. Linda won't go down without a fight. John stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. He didn't need the warning. He already knew Linda was dangerous. The real question was whether he was ready to face whatever came next. The documents spread across John's kitchen table felt heavier than mere paper. Each word, each signature, painted a clearer picture of the lengths Linda Collins had gone to in order to protect her position. The deeper he dug, the more disgusted he became. She wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. He flipped through the letters, his eyes landing on another handwritten note. This one wasn't signed by Linda, but by Edward's father. It referred to a significant transfer of funds marked as discretionary services. What made John pause was the date, 2 months before Edward Blake Sr.'s death. John leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Discretionary services, he muttered to himself. What the hell does that mean? He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the letter. His gut told him it wasn't a coincidence, and he needed Edward's take on it, as he began organizing the papers back into the folder. A loud knock at the door startled him. Who's there? He called out, his voice sharp. Just open the door, Miller, a familiar voice replied. John frowned as he opened the door to find James, Edward's loyal assistant, standing there with a folder in hand. He looked as composed as ever, but there was something different about his expression, an urgency that was uncharacteristic of the stoic man. James, John said, stepping aside to let him in. What are you doing here? James walked in, glancing around before lowering his voice. Mr. Blake asked me to deliver this to you. He thought it might help you understand what's at stake. John took the folder, his frown deepening. What is it? Details about Linda's past dealings, James said. But it's not just about her. There are connections that go beyond the Blake family. Connections? John asked, flipping open the folder. Inside were copies of financial statements, legal documents, and what appeared to be surveillance photos of Linda meeting with various people. One name stood out immediately: Donovan Security Services. John's stomach twisted. "This name keeps coming up," he said, pointing to the company. "What do they have to do with this?" James hesitated. "They're a private firm, one with a reputation for operating in the shadows. They were hired by Mr. Blake Sr. for, let's say, sensitive matters." John's eyes narrowed. "And by sensitive, you mean illegal?" James gave a small nod. "Possibly there's evidence suggesting they were involved in activities ranging from intimidation to worse." John's pulse quickened. "Are you saying they might have had something to do with his death?" James straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm saying it's a possibility worth exploring." Later that evening, John sat in his truck outside Edward's mansion, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The folder James had delivered sat on the passenger seat, and his mind was racing with questions. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever truth was waiting for him inside, but he knew he couldn't back out now. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed the folder and headed to the door. James let him in without a word, leading him straight to Edward's study. Edward looked up from his desk as John entered, his face lined with exhaustion. "You found something," he said, more a statement than a question. "Yeah," John replied, dropping the folder onto the desk. "And I'm guessing you already know what it is." Edward opened the folder, scanning the documents. His jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages, his silence speaking volumes. "So," John pressed, "are you going to tell me what Donovan Security Services really is?" Edward closed the folder. Leaning back in his chair, "They're trouble," he said simply. "My father hired them for years to handle certain issues. Linda continued to use them after his death." John's hands clenched into fists. "Issues like threatening my mom." Edward nodded reluctantly. "Among other things." "And now what?" John asked, his voice rising. "You think they had something to do with your dad's death?" Edward hesitated, his gaze dropping to the folder. "I don't know, but if they did, Linda would be the one to know. She had access to all his accounts, all his contacts. If there's a connection, it's through her." John shook his head. "John," frustration bubbling over. "This is insane. She's not just some bitter ex. She's dangerous. And if we're right, she's not going to stop until she takes everything." Edward stood, his expression hardening, "Which is why we can't let her win." That night, John returned home with a plan forming in his mind. He knew Linda wouldn't go down without a fight, and he wasn't naive enough to think this would end without some sort of confrontation. But for the first time, he felt like he and Edward were on the same page. He sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the documents once more. The name Donovan Security Services stared back at him, a reminder of just how deep this went. He grabbed his phone and dialed Edward's number. "We need to move fast," he said when Edward picked up. "If Linda catches wind of what we're doing, she'll destroy any evidence." Edward's voice was firm. "Agreed. I'll have James start digging into Donovan's records. In the meantime, you need to stay alert. Linda won't sit idle." John hung up, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he was going to get to the bottom of this. Linda Collins had messed with the wrong family. The morning air was crisp as John parked his truck outside a small diner on the outskirts of Beverly Hills. Edward had suggested they meet somewhere discreet, away from the prying eyes and ears of Linda or anyone in her circle. John wasn't sure how much of a difference it would make, but he wasn't taking any chances. Edward was already seated in a corner booth when John walked in. He looked out of place in his tailored suit amidst the greasy counters and chipped coffee mugs. But he didn't seem to care. His focus was on a stack of papers in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You look like you didn't sleep," John said, sliding into the booth across from him. Edward glanced up, offering a faint smile. "I didn't. I've been going through everything James and I could dig up on Donovan Security Services. It's worse than I thought." John picked up one of the papers, scanning the dense paragraphs of text. "Worse how?" "They're not just a private security firm," Edward explained, lowering his voice. "They specialize in blackmail, cover-ups, and, in some cases, eliminating threats." John's stomach churned. "And you think Linda hired them to get rid of your dad?" Edward nodded grimly. "The timeline fits. My father started pulling away from her just before his death. She knew her position was at risk. Hiring Donovan would have been a way to secure her control over the family fortune. John exhaled slowly, trying to process the weight of Edward's words. So, what do we do now? Edward leaned forward, his voice firm. We need proof. Something that ties Linda directly to Donovan's operations. John frowned. And how exactly are we supposed to get that? She's not just going to hand over a confession. Edward smirked faintly. No, but she's made mistakes before. James managed to find a connection. An old accountant who handled some of her private accounts. If we can convince him to talk, we might have what we need. Later that afternoon, John found himself in a cramped office in a strip mall, staring at a man who looked like he hadn't left the room in weeks. The accountant, a wiry man named Victor, shifted nervously in his chair, his eyes darting between John and Edward. I don't know what you want me to say, Victor stammered, adjusting his glasses. I don't work for her anymore. But you did, Edward said, his tone calm but insistent. And you know how she operates. We're not asking for much, Victor. Just enough to connect her to Donovan. Victor swallowed hard, glancing at the door like he was considering making a run for it. You don't understand. She's not someone you cross. Neither was my father, Edward countered, his voice hardening. And look where that got him. Victor froze, his eyes widening slightly. You think she had something to do with that? We don't think, Victor, John said, leaning forward. We know. The only question is whether you're going to help us prove it. Victor hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. There's a storage unit, he said quietly. She kept files there, records, contracts. I handled the payments for it until a few years ago. If those documents are still there, they might have what you're looking for. Edward's eyes narrowed. Where is it? Victor scribbled an address on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. But be careful, he warned. If she finds out you've been there, she won't just let it go. That evening, John and Edward stood outside a nondescript storage facility on the edge of the city. The air was heavy with anticipation as they approached the unit Victor had described. You sure about this? John asked, glancing at Edward. No, Edward admitted, but we don't have a choice. John nodded, taking a deep breath as Edward unlocked the door. The unit was dimly lit, filled with neatly labeled boxes and filing cabinets. It didn't look like much, but John could feel the weight of what they were about to uncover. They began sorting through the boxes, scanning documents and setting aside anything that seemed relevant. Hours passed, and John was starting to wonder if they'd find anything useful when Edward suddenly froze. John, he said, holding up a folder. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. What is it? John asked, walking over. Edward handed him the folder, and John's eyes widened as he read the contents. Inside were contracts signed by Linda and Donovan Security Services, detailing payments for discretionary services around the time of Edward Sr.'s death. But what made John's blood run cold was a handwritten note at the bottom of one of the pages. Ensure the target is neutralized. No loose ends. John swallowed hard. This is it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is what we need. Edward nodded, his expression grim. But now we have to figure out what to do with it. Linda won't go down quietly. As they left the storage unit, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkened parking lot. It was empty, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. You okay? Edward asked as they reached the car. Yeah, John said, though he didn't feel okay. Just, let's get out of here. As they drove away, John couldn't help but wonder what Linda would do when she realized they had the proof to destroy her. One thing was certain. This fight was far from over. The next morning, John stood in his kitchen, staring at the folder they'd retrieved from the storage unit. The damning evidence was spread across his table, proof that Linda had orchestrated Edward Sr.'s death and covered her tracks with ruthless precision. The implications were staggering, and the weight of it all pressed heavily on John's shoulders. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was Edward. Did you sleep? Edward asked when John answered. John let out a humorless laugh. Does it look like I did? Edward sighed on the other end. I feel the same. We have what we need. But now comes the hard part, making sure this doesn't blow up in our faces. Yeah, about that, John said, glancing at the folder. "What's the plan here? We can't exactly walk into the police station and hand this over without Linda finding out." "I know," Edward said. "That's why I've reached out to someone I trust, a friend in law enforcement. He's agreed to meet us this afternoon." "You trust him?" John asked, his tone skeptical. "As much as I trust anyone in this situation," Edward replied. "He's not tied to Linda, and he's helped me before, if anyone can take her down." "It's him." John hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." By mid-afternoon, John and Edward were sitting in a small, dimly lit office in a nondescript building downtown. Across from them sat Detective Mark Collins, a man in his late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "So," Mark said, leaning back in his chair as he flipped through the folder, "you're telling me Linda Collins orchestrated Edward Essier's death and used Donovan's security services to cover it up?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Edward replied, his tone steady. Mark let out a low whistle. "I've heard rumors about Donovan before, but nothing this concrete. If this holds up, it could bring down more than just Linda." John frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark tapped the folder. "If Donovan's involved, there's a good chance this connects to other cases. Unsolved ones. They don't just operate in isolation. Taking them down could expose an entire network." John exchanged a glance with Edward. The stakes had just risen higher than either of them had anticipated. "What do we need to do?" Edward asked. Mark's expression turned serious. "We need to proceed carefully. If Linda gets wind of this before we're ready, she'll destroy any remaining evidence and go underground. Worse, she might come after you two." John felt a chill run down his spine. "So what's the play?" "I'll start by corroborating what you've given me," Mark said. "I'll need a few days to cross-check these documents and see if I can link Linda to other Donovan clients. In the meantime, you two need to stay low. Don't give her any reason to suspect you're onto her." Edward nodded, but John felt uneasy. Linda wasn't the type to sit idle, and the thought of what she might do if she suspected their plan made his stomach churn. That evening, back at his house, John tried to distract himself by fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom, but his mind kept drifting to the folder and the conversation with Mark. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Linda was already a step ahead. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Edward. "Stay alert. I've got a bad feeling about this." John was about to reply when he heard a noise outside. He froze, listening carefully. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Grabbing a wrench from the counter, he crept toward the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, but then a shadow moved near the edge of his property. His pulse quickened. "Who's out there?" he called, stepping onto the porch. The shadow froze for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. John's heart raced as he scanned the yard, but whoever it was had vanished. The next morning, John and Edward met again, this time at a small park away from prying eyes. Edward looked as tense as John felt, his suit slightly rumpled, and his face lined with exhaustion. "Something's off," John said, as they walked along a quiet path. "Last night, I swear someone was outside my house." Edward frowned. "Did you see who it was?" "No," John admitted, "but it's got to be her people. She knows something's up." Edward cursed under his breath. "If Linda's onto us, we need to move faster. Mark said he needed a few days, but we might not have that long." John nodded. "So what do we do?" Edward stopped, his gaze hardening. "We push her, force her to make a mistake." John raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" Edward hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "We let her know we're not afraid of her. If she's watching, we use that to our advantage. I'll reach out. Arrange a meeting she won't be able to resist." John's stomach twisted at the thought of confronting Linda directly, but he knew Edward was right. If they waited too long, she'd find a way to strike first. "All right," John said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." That evening, Edward sent Linda a message through one of her known associates, arranging a meeting at an upscale restaurant downtown. The bait was simple. He claimed to have information she'd find valuable, something that could impact the Blake family legacy. John watched as Edward typed out the message, his own nerves fraying. "You sure about this?" "No," Edward admitted, hitting send. "But it's our best shot." The trap was set, now. All they could do was wait. The The sleek black car pulled up to the valet outside Millionaire, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Beverly Hills. Linda Collins stepped out, her movements precise, her posture regal. She adjusted the cuff of her tailored jacket and glanced at the entrance, her lips curling into a faint smirk. Inside, Edward was already seated at a corner table, his demeanor calm but his shoulders tense. John sat across from him, fidgeting with his napkin. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation, the clinking of glasses and silverware creating an elegant backdrop to what John knew would be anything but a civilized meeting. "She's here," Edward murmured, his eyes flicking toward the door. John followed his gaze and felt his chest tighten. Linda exuded confidence as she walked toward their table, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She looked every bit the untouchable socialite, but John knew better now. Behind that poised exterior was a woman capable of anything. "Edward," Linda said smoothly as she reached the table. Her eyes drifted to John, and her smile widened. "And the prodigal son? How quaint." Edward gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Linda." She took her seat, crossing her legs elegantly. "I must admit, I was intrigued by your message. Something I'd find valuable. I can't imagine what you think you have that I don't already know." Edward didn't blink. "I think you'll find it's quite a lot." John leaned forward, his voice sharp. "We know what you did, Linda. We have the proof." Linda tilted her head, her expression bemused. "Proof? Proof of what, exactly?" "Don't play games," Edward said, his tone cold. "We know about Donovan Security Services, the payments, the orders, the storage unit. We know you had my father killed." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Linda's face. Discomfort. Maybe, or anger, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a practiced smile. "Such bold accusations," she said, her voice dripping with mock pity. "But really, Edward, this is beneath you, digging through old papers, dragging this poor boy into your delusions." John's fists clenched under the table. "Don't talk about me like I'm not here." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. After all, you're the one who stands to gain the most from all this drama. A sudden inheritance, a place in the Blake family fortune. It must be quite the dream come true." John stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You think this is about money? You think I want anything from you?" "Sit down, John," Edward said quietly, his gaze fixed on Linda. Linda's smile didn't waver. "Edward, let's not turn this into a spectacle. If you truly had proof, you wouldn't be sitting here. You'd be handing it over to the authorities. But instead, you're here, trying to rattle me. It's almost endearing." Edward leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You're right. If I had all the proof I needed, I wouldn't be here. But I do have enough to ruin you, Linda. And if you think I won't use it, you don't know me as well as you think." Linda's smile faltered slightly, and her eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." Edward reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim USB drive, placing it on the table. "Am I?" Linda stared at the drive, her expression unreadable. The restaurant around them seemed to fade away, the tension between them palpable. "You don't have the stomach for this, Edward," Linda said finally, her voice quieter but no less sharp. "You never have. That's why I had to clean up after you and your father for years. Do you think anyone will believe you now? Do you think you can outmaneuver me?" John couldn't take it anymore. "You're done, Linda," he said, his voice firm. "You can't cover this up. Not this time." Linda's gaze snapped to him, her eyes cold and calculating. "Careful, boy. You don't know who you're dealing with." Edward stood, towering over Linda. "You're the one who should be careful. Walk away now, Linda. Leave everything behind and disappear. It's the only chance you have left." Linda rose slowly, her composure cracking just slightly. "You're making a mistake, Edward. And you," she said, pointing at John, "should remember that the Blakes chew up and spit out people like you." She turned on her heel and strode out of the restaurant, her back stiff, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Edward sat back down, exhaling deeply. "You think that worked?" John asked, his voice low. Edward shook his head. "No, but she knows we're serious now. She'll make a move. And when she does, we'll be ready." As Linda left the restaurant, she pulled out her phone, dialing a number with practiced ease. "We have a problem," she said, her voice clipped. "Handle it." The night felt heavier than usual, the air thick with an impending sense of danger. John paced the living room of his small home, his phone clenched tightly in his hand. Edward had called him minutes earlier, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "She's not backing down," Edward had said, "and I don't think she's acting alone anymore. Be careful." The warning played on a loop in John's mind. Linda was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. A sudden knock at the door startled him. He grabbed a wrench from the counter, a makeshift weapon, and approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "It's James," a familiar voice replied, calm but strained. John opened the door to find James standing there, his usual stoic demeanor cracking just slightly. "We need to move quickly," James said, stepping inside. "Edward believes Linda has hired someone to retrieve the evidence. She knows we have enough to bury her." John's stomach churned. "So what do we do? Sit here and wait for her to come after us?" "No," James said, shaking his head. "Edward has arranged a secure location for you. He wants you to leave now." John hesitated, glancing at the folder on the kitchen table. "I'm not running, not now." James stepped closer, his voice firm. "This isn't running. This is buying time. Linda won't go down without a fight, and if she comes after you, it won't just be a scare tactic." John clenched his jaw but nodded reluctantly. "Fine, let's go." As they drove toward the safe house Edward had arranged, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. The city lights blurred past the window, but his focus was on the folder in his lap, the evidence they'd risked so much to gather. Suddenly, James swerved the car sharply, pulling into a side street. "Hold on," he said, his voice tight. "What the hell are you doing?" John demanded, gripping the dashboard. "We're being followed," James said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Black SUV, been on us since we left your house." John twisted in his seat, catching a glimpse of the vehicle in question. His heart pounded. "Linda's people, most likely," James replied, his voice calm despite the situation. "Hold tight." James navigated the streets with precision, taking sharp turns and cutting through alleys in an attempt to lose their tail. But the SUV stayed with them, its headlights a constant presence in the rearview mirror. "This isn't working," John said, his voice rising. "Trust me," James said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As they approached an intersection, James slammed on the brakes, causing the SUV behind them to swerve. Without hesitation, James accelerated again, taking a sudden left turn. The SUV hesitated, then sped past the intersection, disappearing into the distance. "Is it gone?" John asked, his heart racing. "For now," James said, pulling the car to the side of the road. "But we need to move fast." When they arrived at the safe house, a modest cabin on the outskirts of the city, Edward was already waiting. He stood on the porch, his face pale but determined. "Did they follow you?" Edward asked as they approached. "Not anymore," James replied. "But they're getting bolder." Edward nodded grimly. "It's only a matter of time before they make another move." John handed him the folder. "This is what they want. If it's this important to them, why not just take it to the cops now?" Edward shook his head. "We need to be strategic. Mark is still building the case, and if Linda suspects we've already turned it over, she'll disappear before we can stop her." "So what do we do?" John asked, frustration lacing his voice. Edward met his eyes, his expression hardening. "We make her come to us." That night, Edward sent Linda a message, one designed to lure her into a trap. He claimed to have additional evidence stored at the cabin and suggested they meet to discuss a potential deal. John was skeptical of the plan, but Edward assured him it was their best chance to expose her. Hours passed in tense silence as they waited. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind outside made John's nerves fray further. Finally, headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the dirt road leading to the cabin. "She's here," Edward said, standing by the window. John grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room, his grip tight. "You sure about this?" Edward nodded. "Stay out of sight. Let me handle her." Linda entered the cabin moments later, flanked by two imposing men in suits. Her eyes immediately locked onto Edward, her expression cold and calculating. "Edward," she said, her tone dripping with mock civility. "I must admit, I'm impressed. You're braver than I gave you credit for." Edward remained calm. "I'm not here to play games, Linda. This ends tonight." Linda's gaze swept the room, lingering on the folder on the table. "And you think this little stunt is going to stop me?" "I don't think," Edward said, his voice steady. "I know." At that moment, the front door burst open, and Detective Mark Collins entered with a team of officers. "Linda Collins, you're under arrest," Mark announced, his voice firm. Linda's composure cracked as the officers surrounded her. "You'll regret this, Edward," she hissed. "You're destroying your own family." "No," Edward said, his voice cold. "I'm saving it." As Linda was led away in handcuffs, John felt a wave of relief wash over him. The danger wasn't entirely gone, but the woman who had cast a shadow over their lives for decades was finally being held accountable. Edward turned to John, his expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You were right to fight, John." "Thank you." John nodded, his chest tightening. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for my mom, for the life she deserved." Edward placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Then let's make sure her sacrifices weren't in vain." In the weeks that followed, Linda's arrest sent shockwaves through the Blake family and beyond. Donovan Security Services was exposed, unraveling a network of corruption that reached far deeper than anyone had anticipated. For John, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. His relationship with Edward was far from perfect, but it was a start, a fragile connection built on shared pain and the hope for something better. As he stood on the porch of his home one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, John allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead wasn't easy, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.